Welcome. I'll guide you through the Module 3 summary of Gabor's teachings. And again, the theme for Module 3 is trauma, disconnection, and constriction. The outline for Module 3 includes ego and essence, what is trauma, trauma as disconnection, from states to traits, sensitivity and trauma, teaching about trauma, how to ask about trauma, the patriarchal culture, trauma and eating disorders, social cultural trauma, trauma and psychosis, epigenetics and trauma, PTSD, false memory syndrome, perpetrators, and gut feelings. We'll start with a discussion of ego in essence. Ego is the I that runs our lives, and part of this ego is conscious, and a greater part of it is unconscious. The ego is concerned with the preservation, the enhancement, and the survival of the self. It protects us against threats to our existence, and it also protects us from pain. A healthy ego helps us set boundaries, make choices and decisions, set priorities, maintain discipline, and manage relationships, and many other things. But the ego is largely unconscious because the pain that it defends against was too hurtful to be consciously acknowledged. And this pain that it defends against occurred during childhood. In other words, the self that we identify with as the ego and the personality doesn't really want to know itself because there's too much pain. It's afraid to be challenged and discovered. And our ego identifies with a certain group and set of beliefs. When the group beliefs that we hold are threatened, our very self is threatened. And so we're going to defend those beliefs, even if they're not true. The ego, above all else, wants your health and your survival. It doesn't want bad things, but it doesn't know how to get you what you need. And so it does the best it can. It gives you substitutes, like toxic relationships, certain activities, possessions, addictions, the need for approval, the need to be liked, the need to be loved. Ultimately, the ego wants to get you the love that you didn't get as a child, but it doesn't quite know how. And the difficulty is that we identify with our ego. We think it is who we are. It almost becomes a separate structure that wants its own survival above all else, even when it's hurting you. It's a defensive structure. It's desperate to survive because it doesn't think that you can survive without it. So it's ultimately trying to protect you. It has no idea that there is a deeper self through you that has nothing to do with ego. And we call that deeper self your essence. You can also call it your spirit, your true self. From the point of view of essence, you don't need to get love because you are love. That's who we really are. From the deeper sense, you don't have to work to get truth because you are truth. You know the truth. And when you see truth, you recognize it as yourself. That's from the perception of essence. The more you move towards your essence, the more the ego realizes that it's not needed. And then the more desperate it becomes to maintain its stronghold. It defends you not only against external threats, but also against the truth. It's threatened by the truth because it is a defensive structure. And once you realize the truth, you don't need to defend anymore. So there's parts of the ego that will deconstruct or disintegrate once you realize the truth. The ego is burdened with responsibilities, with being vigilant, and with being defensive. And the essence of therapy is really to put the ego in its place not for it to run your life. It's not to destroy the ego, but to put it in its place. We want to utilize all the skills that the ego developed and have them in service of the self or in service of the essence, not for protection, but for expression and growth. So we can use those skills for expression and growth, and we don't need them so much to defend us, to protect us. We can recognize, however, that the ego and its structures are there to protect us. We can acknowledge what it has done for us without pushing it away or judging it. We can show the ego that this deeper part of you, your essence, can guide you. We don't need to get rid of the ego. We just need to know that it's not the real you and put it in its place. We don't eliminate or transcend the ego because it will resist being eliminated. It'll fight back. But instead, we want to befriend and integrate the ego. We need to utilize the executive function of the ego to plan, to make decisions, to analyze, to motivate if we live in this world. And if we are going to give up the ego or transcend the ego as a saint, then basically we need somebody else to look after us, to take care of those functions. Now that we know the difference between ego and essence, we'll explore what is trauma. So trauma is not just the bad things that happen to you, it's also the absence of good things that should have happened to you. So it's not just what happened, it's also what didn't happen. It's not the event that happens, but it's what happens in the individual, inside the individual, as a result of that external event. It happens in the body, and it happens on the level of the psyche, and ultimately, trauma causes a disconnect from yourself, or trauma is the disconnect from the self, from the essence. There are 6 hallmarks of trauma that Gabor identifies. The first is that it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. The second is trauma results in a disconnection from yourself, from your value as a person, from your feelings, your emotions, from your physical body, from other people, and from the world. Trauma shapes your view of the world, causing a constriction. You override your gut feelings, which help you survive due to trauma. So you're no longer listening or paying attention to those gut feelings. Trauma makes it difficult to be in the present moment. We're in the past more than we're in the present. And trauma changes your nervous system in several fundamental ways. Trauma happens inside of us. And here's this wonderful quote by Almas describing what happens. He says, the fundamental thing that happened and the greatest calamity is not that there was no love or support. The greater calamity, which was caused by that first calamity, is that you've lost a connection to your essence. That is much more important than whether or not your mother or father loved you or not. There's this essential true being that manifests through each of us that we can call our essence or the true self. And we lose this connection to this dynamic because of trauma. And that's the deeper trauma. This is the fundamental loss, the real trauma. Western psychology doesn't really recognize essence or the true self, but instead it tries to fix the ego so that the ego is healthier. In Western psychology, there's no real awareness that there's something deeper that we have lost the connection to. However, this is understood in Eastern spiritual traditions, in Buddhism, in yoga and meditation. When the child does tell the parent, if something traumatic happens, the child does not get nurtured and may not even be believed. And it's because of this disconnect from the parent and the parent's inability to soothe the child or to help the child be heard or being validated, that we disconnect from ourselves. And we have to do this to survive. This is an adaptation to what's happened. It's not wrong. If we didn't have the capacity to disconnect, how would we survive our childhoods? So most problems that people come to us with, whether it's an emotional problem, a mental illness, or physical illness, results from this disconnect from the self caused by trauma. And this can show up as depression, anxiety, psychosis, eating disorders, addictions, ADHD, autoimmune disease, cancer, chronic inflammatory conditions of the skin, asthma, muscular problems, or any inflammation in the brain. But the primary trauma was whatever made us vulnerable to this disconnection from ourselves. What made us vulnerable was the disconnection from the primary connection provided by nurturing adults. So the real original trauma is the lack of connection to our parents, to our mother or our father or a nurturing adult. And that is ultimately what causes us to disconnect from ourselves. Focusing only on the event that happened, whether it's a physical abuse or a sexual abuse or an ecological disaster like an earthquake or a fire or a car accident or the death of somebody, focusing only on the event won't complete the healing because the person was already traumatized before they were traumatized by the event. That's key. They had already disconnected. And so they don't really know what they feel because they had to shut down their feelings because their feelings weren't received by their primary caregivers. So they learn to suppress their feelings. Trauma causes a constriction within us. It makes our future responses to the world more limited. It interferes with the natural growth process. The natural growth process is about development and unfolding of insight and intelligence, curiosity and relationships unfolding like a tree. And trauma stops that. It stunts it. It's like a tree that's growth is stunted. Trauma causes a constriction so that our body awareness is limited and the capacity that we have to regulate our responses to the present moment is thwarted. The part of the brain called the midfrontal cortex is responsible for us having a flexible response to various situations, which means when an external trigger occurs, we can be flexible in our response according to what's needed. We can choose A, B, C, or D as a way of responding to something that occurs. But trauma restricts us to a set of predictable automatic reactions. It might be a fear reaction, an anger reaction, a hiding reaction, a running away reaction, a shutting down reaction. The more traumatized you are, the more limited, restricted, and stereotyped those reactions will be. You've been traumatized not when you felt pain, but when after the trauma you are more limited in your view and in your capacities to respond than you were before. So that's one of the hallmarks of trauma. Our capacity to respond is diminished. It's limited. There's a narrowing of perspective in every field that we look at. And now we'll listen to Gabor talk about what trauma is and how it affects us.
People use the word trauma rather loosely as bad feelings or a difficult experience. That's not what trauma is. Trauma is what actually happens internal to us. And it happens on the body level for sure, and it happens on the level of the psyche. And Peter Levine, whose work I'm sure many of you know, defines trauma as a disconnect from the self. It's a disconnection from the self. I'm going to give you a somewhat broader explanation of trauma. So, trauma is anything that changes you in a way that makes your future responses to the world more limited. So that's a limit. It interferes with the natural growth process, because the natural growth process is development and unfolding of insight and intelligence and curiosity, relationship. That's the natural process. It's like a tree. This is the natural process. Trauma will stop that, and you come out of the trauma more limited than when you went in. So that means your body awareness is limited, your capacity to regulate your responses. The midfrontal cortex here in the brain, one of its several tasks is what's called response flexibility. And that simply means when some external trigger occurs, you have the capacity to actually be flexible in your response according to what's needed at the time. Now, trauma limits that, and it constricts you, restricts you to a set of rather predictable automatic reactions. And the more traumatized you are, the more limited and restricted those reactions will be, more stereotypical they will be. So trauma is what happens inside the person. It's a limitation, and the greater the trauma, the greater the limitation.
Trauma also changes our nervous system. When we're traumatized, we're in flight or fight mode, or we're in freeze mode and we dissociate. And any of these may be associated with a stomach upset or breathing problems. And what happens when we're in one of these modes is that we're not using the higher circuits in our brain to investigate or understand our experience. So there's a shutting down of the higher circuits of the brain and a diminished function of this prefrontal cortex. And trauma changes the nervous system so that we will act as though we're in a defensive mode, even when there's no danger. So that's an automatic reaction, a stereotypical response. Our defensiveness is one of those traumatic responses, even when there's no danger. So the nervous system is reshaped so that we have a bias towards danger. We see danger when it's not there. And trauma puts us into this permanent defensive mode, and it shows up in our relationships. We'll be perhaps more argumentative, take offense easily, react more acutely to a small trigger because of that defensiveness. Trauma can also distort our relationships and cause us to seek relationships with people who either rescue us from ourselves. So you might be very upset with them when they don't rescue you, and will look for someone else to rescue you or to take care of you. Or you might seek a relationship unwittingly where you reenact all the trauma that you've already experienced because that's what you think is normal. So you'll attract somebody or be interested in somebody who reminds you of one of the people in your life, one of your parents perhaps, or another important figure in your childhood that traumatized you, because that's what you know. Trauma also affects the body in various ways. It increases inflammation. Markers of inflammation in the blood are chronically higher in people who have been traumatized. There might be C-reactive protein or fibrinogen, for example, are two markers of inflammation. And this makes these people more susceptible to chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, colitis, asthma, skin conditions, and autoimmune diseases. So many of these illnesses have their roots in trauma. The trauma need not happen to the child directly because the child absorbs the trauma of its mother. The child is aware of its own body, but can also feel the tension, the rigidity, and the pain in the body of its mother. If the mother suffers, the baby also suffers, and then the child's pain is not discharged. The child's pain is instead internalized. For the body to release its pain, it needs to be held, and the child needs to be assured that the pain will end. If the child is not held because the mother is traumatized or incapable of holding the child or not knowing how to be with the child, then the pain will stay in the child. And the child will fear that these difficult emotional states are permanent. And the child will think to themselves, I'll stay stuck in this. I will never get out of this. And that becomes a lifelong belief, an unconscious lifelong belief. And then what do? As children, we develop behaviors to give us relief. And those behaviors can stick because the original pain hasn't been dealt with, it was suppressed. In other words, if our parents, when we're children, are not able to regulate us, to comfort us, to let us know that this pain is temporary, to console us and validate our emotions, then one way for us to cope is to do work to bring the parent into relationship with us. We become who they need us to be. So we develop patterns to regulate ourselves inside by what we do for others or in relationship to others. And then these coping patterns become our personalities. And they separate us from ourselves. But we think that's who we are. It's not really who we are. But it's how we developed only because we had to disconnect from what it really felt like to be a child in that family or under those circumstances. The child's self-concept, the image that the child carries of itself, comes from its parents as if from a mirror. If the parents are broken and traumatized, the child will learn a distorted image of itself. So it's not who the child is. And the pain may not belong to the child, it may belong to the mother or the father. But the child takes it on. It takes on this self-concept from the parent as well as the pain from the parent. The child will believe that all the brokenness of its parents is his or her fault. It will take on the unconscious belief that it must have done something wrong or in some way is not good enough. And it's such a common belief in so many of us that somehow we've done something wrong or in some way we're not good enough. This can show up in a child with, for example, stomach upsets. A stomach ache in a child is always a sign of stress in the environment and that the child is not being regulated by the parents. What could a 1-year-old do when he or she has unpleasant, strong feelings that no one can relieve? What can that child do? It can cry, but it can internalize those feelings also with colic or stomach upset. Children learn to dissociate, they tune out, and it's not as though they're consciously doing this, but their brain does it automatically to protect them. And it becomes a strategy to remove themselves from painful, emotionally uncomfortable environments. Their brains do it automatically, and then later they're diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. It's simply a coping mechanism. Here's a quote from the Journal of Pediatrics. taken from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. What this is saying is that children adapt to early stress and trauma with coping mechanisms to help them endure that time of difficulty. And then those same coping patterns become sources of dysfunction and pathology later on, and are the source of all mental illness and many physiological diseases. So that which helps us cope in one situation becomes a problem in another situation. And the adaptation that initially had a function that was meant to be a temporary state and protective becomes a long-term trait and dysfunctional. These long-term traits make up much of what we call the personality. So it could be the trait of perfectionism, the trait of superiority, the trait of goodness, or being nice, or being a pleaser, the trait of making others laugh, the trait of continuously helping others. All of those traits become part of the personality. And then other people applaud us for those traits. We get rewarded for them. We start to believe it's who we are. The personality is really a constellation of some genuine qualities covered with a mask, a bunch of coping mechanisms. We start to believe that that's who we are. And the essence of therapy is really to bring people back to their real selves, who we were before all of that happened, before we adopted all of those adaptations and coping mechanisms. Addiction is an attempt to regulate oneself, to get rid of an unpleasant feeling and replace it with a pleasant one, to regulate the nervous system. And secondary behaviors that follow addiction are lying, cheating, betraying everything and everybody. And then this is followed by shame. We can recognize that even addiction is only a set of adaptations. It's a way to cope. And we can bring this understanding to our clients so that they can learn in our compassionate presence. They use these to survive. And in a way, they deserve congratulations that they found something to relieve their discomfort, to survive childhood or the teen years or young adulthood, to deal with the pain that was inside of them. Perhaps without these coping mechanisms, they would not have survived. Perhaps another illness would have taken them. Perhaps they would have committed suicide. Perhaps something else would have happened to them. Now we'll talk about sensitivity and trauma. Some people are genetically programmed to be more sensitive than others, and they experience hurt and pain more deeply. What is not painful to another less sensitive person is painful to these people. They are thin-skinned. They lack a protective barrier between themselves and the outside world. And their nerves, you could say, are closer to the surface. The more sensitive you are, the less has to happen for you to feel pain. And the more pain you feel, the more you have to adapt to that pain by shutting down. It's the only alternative. So consequently, some of the most hardened criminals are the most sensitive people. And the reason that they are so hardened is because they are so sensitive. It's too painful to be that sensitive. There was one study that looked at aggression, and the scientists found that people that were the most aggressive had a certain gene. In the same group, people that were the least aggressive had the same gene as the people that were most aggressive compared to the average people in the study. How do you explain that? It turned out that the gene was not for aggression, but the people that were most aggressive were brought up in abusive homes. And the people that were least aggressive were brought up in supportive homes. And really the gene was for sensitivity. Now we'll talk about vicarious trauma. Vicarious means that a person is traumatized by what happened to somebody else. Gabor says there's no such thing as vicarious trauma. When these people hear the stories of their clients, the trauma that actually happened to them is activated. So it's a personal wound that's activated when we witness or hear the story of trauma in somebody else. The trigger for it is listening to the stories or seeing the pain and suffering of their clients. But it's their own trauma, and that trauma would be in them whether or not they ever met that client. It just might be a little bit more unconscious. We've all been wounded. We all have some capacity to heal ourselves and to help heal others. But in order to do this, it's important to understand what happened to us. We have to recognize what happened to us as children. We have to get underneath our delusion of having had a happy childhood and actually acknowledge what went on. We don't always have to know the details, but we need to have a general sense. Otherwise, we blame ourselves, saying, I'm just a bad person. And we can devalue ourselves as being worthless, not understanding how certain traits came about within us, not understanding that it wasn't our fault. We can know what happened to us, but we don't need to blame anyone, nor do we need to resign ourselves to the belief that it's just how we are. So there's another way through, without blaming and without resignation. And the way out is to say, I feel the way I feel because of what happened many, many years ago. But that doesn't mean I have to be this way. I'm not a victim of it. I don't have to stay this way. I can work through this feeling. I can get to the bottom of it, and I can choose to be different. Part of the way of working through the feelings is to recognize and acknowledge the feeling is there, or recognize and acknowledge a particular belief is there, without identifying with that. For example, we might say to ourselves or experience within ourselves, in me there is sadness, in me there is anger, or I'm experiencing anger, but I'm not angry. I am not angry. Anger is not what I am. I may believe that things are hopeless, but I am not hopeless. Hopeless is not what I am. And the resolution of trauma is not by talking about what happened in the past. It's always about connecting in the present, reconnecting in the present, reconnecting to our feelings, reconnecting to our body, reconnecting to what's going on around us, in our environment, and the people in the present moment. Every time someone engages in the line of questioning used in compassion inquiry in a safe setting with a compassionate listener, they get a bit closer to themselves, and that's the resolution. Repeating that process over and over again, so we reconnect in the present to our bodies, to our feelings, to our surroundings, to the people around us. Reconnection with ourselves, feeling into the body and emotions, being in the present moment, having the capacity to examine our perceptions without being hijacked by the past is the route to healing. What happened in the past can't be erased. We can't undo it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. But what we make it mean about ourselves and how we relate to others and the world can change. That's what we can shift. And it's always possible to connect with ourselves in the present moment, to connect with the body, to connect with our breath, to connect with an emotion in the present moment. The end result of the resolution of trauma and the end result of the healing process is that we recognize that we are whole and undamaged. We connect with our essence or the true self, and we recognize that this part of ourselves is always free, clean, and whole. And ultimately, when we understand this, there's nothing to forgive, no one to forgive, because there has been no damage. And we'll talk about how to ask about trauma. When you don't have the eyes to see something, you don't see it. Trauma is so common in our culture that we almost take it for granted. The traumatic event that instigates what happens inside of you could be relatively minor if looked at from the point of view of an adult. But it's not so minor from the point of view of the infant or young child who's experiencing it. It may be difficult to ask what actually did happen to some clients, but if you ask, who did you speak to about it? The answer is always going to be nobody. Or somebody might say, my friends or my sister, but rarely or never a parent. If they did ask the parent, they might say, I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. Or I told my parents and they actually took action, but they did nothing to help me. Or the action that they did was of no help to me. And many people will say, I had a good childhood and there was no sexual abuse, no violence, no addiction. And then you ask, did anything ever happen that upset you, that made you sad as a child? Were there incidents in your childhood where you were scared, upset, bullied, or violated? Who did you talk to about it? And there's where the truth comes out, and that something did happen and they were not able to talk to anybody about it. Because there was never anyone to talk to, the relational container was missing for the child, and so the child's feelings did not get discharged. The child did not have an attuned adult present who could soothe the emotional pain. And then this caused the child to disconnect from their own feelings and utilize an adaptation or a coping mechanism to suppress that pain. There's been some research on trauma and eating disorders. Important studies were done on how childhood trauma affects adult outcomes. And these are called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, or the ACEs studies. Dr. Vincent Politi is an international medicine specialist in San Diego, and he was working at an obesity clinic where they found that with rigorous dietary control, they could help people lose weight, but they couldn't help people keep the weight off, and they didn't understand why. And their clients said, listen, don't you get it? We're eating to soothe our pain. And so every one of the clients had been traumatized in childhood. Some of those traumatic events in childhood or those adverse childhood experiences include physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, a parent dying, a parent being jailed, a divorce, violence in the family, a parent being addicted or mentally ill. And for each of these, the risk increases of obesity, addictions, autoimmune disease, cancer, mental illness, dysfunctional behavior, sexually transmitted disease. And these don't just add up, they multiply each other. In considering trauma and eating disorders, it's important to understand that the infant has an underdeveloped nervous system and that the infant is regulated by being in close proximity with the mother's body and being breastfed through eating. And when a baby fusses, the mother brings out the breast. So that's how the baby is soothed with the breast. For the first 6 months, the regulation is mostly through this feeding ritual. So this is what the baby learns, that I can fuss and then I'll get attention. I'll be soothed. I'll be relieved. My emotional pain will be relieved when I am nursed or breastfed. As the child's nervous system begins to develop and he or she becomes more interactive, the mother regulates the child not so much through breastfeeding any longer, but through the social engagement system, which includes smiles, using her voice, using facial expressions, gestures, and interactive play. If the mother or the father is too depressed, distracted, stressed, and traumatized to provide regulation through social engagement, the child learns to self-regulate through eating because it's what it already knows. And this is how this lifelong tendency can develop to overeat, to soothe yourself through food. Next, we'll talk about this assaulted sense of self. Trauma makes it difficult for us to know why we do what we do because there's no language for it. A lot of what we do is unconscious. We don't have words for it. But where there's a history of trauma, especially multi-generational trauma, there's devaluation of a whole set of people. And all the individuals that belong to that group, such as Blacks and First Nations. And that whole group of people are devalued and feel shame. And then the culture or society focuses on what's wrong with those people instead of seeing that basically they're just hurting. Other people don't see their pain, and worse, these people don't see their own pain. But instead they assume that there's something wrong with them. And this has been termed the assaulted sense of self. So this is really social cultural trauma. And society as a whole won't be healed until we deal with social cultural trauma. And we see now in First Nations cultures in Canada and the US that drumming, singing, stories are being shared with society. First Nations peoples are bringing back some of these practices a little bit more to bring healing to their culture. And what they've learned about survival, resilience, and reconnecting with their culture may eventually have a saving value for all of society. Now we'll talk about trauma and psychosis. The more trauma you've experienced, the greater the risk of psychosis. Really, psychosis has an adaptive purpose, and the emotional experience that people who are in a psychotic state relate to us is real. But the reasons that they attribute to that experience may be fictional. In other words, if we have a dream, and in a dream we're running from a Nazi because we're afraid, it's not that we're afraid because the Nazis are chasing us, but the Nazis are chasing us because we're afraid. So we make up a reason in the dream to attribute to the fear. The fear is there already. The fear is in the body. The mind makes up a story to explain the fear. So ideally, we want to have tremendous presence with people who are having hallucinations or are in a delusional state and validate the emotions that they're experiencing. Sometimes they see reality much more deeply than the rest of us. So we want to be with them, see them, and value them. The next topic is epigenetics and trauma. Epigenetics means what experiences activate genes. Certain genes turn off and on by the environment, and certain traits can be acquired epigenetically and can be passed on to the next generation. Not by actually altering the genes, but by altering how the genes function, how they're turned on and off. Turns out that trauma transmission can happen through epigenetic mechanisms. So one generation which is traumatized will relate differently to the next generation and transmit the trauma to them through this epigenetic mechanism. So our emotional environment shapes the functioning of our genes. Ultimately, when we look at our lives and we look at addiction and we look at our behaviors, we can recognize that all of this is happening in a larger system, a larger context. It didn't begin with us or begin with anyone in particular, and there's really no one to blame because it's gone on for generations in one family line and also in the culture. So it's very difficult to fix it when it's multi-generational, epigenetic, and social cultural. So what we can do is have more compassion towards ourselves and to others, and recognize that it's a systematic problem that needs to change. And on this video with Gabor, he talks about this, how the trauma did not begin with the individual.
So when you're looking at that addicted person, that identified, and you're intervening, here's what you're not saying. What you're not saying is that your addiction did not begin with you. It represents a dynamic on a part of our entire family. You just happen to be the one who's manifesting the problem. Maybe because you might be the most sensitive one. But it didn't begin with you. It has to do with the multi-generational history of our family, and it has everything to do with what happened to you in childhood in the context of this family of origin. No. Or for example, when parents bring a kid in with ADHD and they want the physician or the therapist to fix the kid. Well, when people have brought their kids to ADHD meeting, I said, well, if you want to help this child, look at the family system. Because if this child is tuning out, there's something stressing him that he's trying to tune out. So rather than trying to fix him, deal with the stress that he's living with.
The next topic is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's always about childhood, never about an adult experience. One way that we understand this is that if 100 soldiers go into battle, they face the risk of death and injury or death of their comrades. But out of that 100, 15 or 20 come out with PTSD, but 85 do not have PTSD. If you look at the 15, you'll see that they were traumatized in childhood. So PTSD is a form of complex post-traumatic stress. The treatment of PTSD demands a multidisciplinary approach. We also have something called false memory syndrome, when people report memories that didn't happen. But what's true is the emotional state that accompanies the memory. So we know that something happened that resulted in that particular emotional state, but the person just doesn't recall it consciously. But the emotional state is real, is true. We also have the problem of the patriarchal culture, which has suppressed and dominated the feminine principle and dominated women, including sexually. And this feminine, internal feminine, also exists in men. But men degrade the feminine not only in the bodies and minds of the women they deal with, but also within themselves. So the feminine aspect of men has been suppressed in some ways, as well as it's affected women through sexual dominance of males over females to a large degree. So collectively, what do we do about this? We reclaim and honor the feminine without putting down the masculine. We reclaim and honor the feminine. And the feminine is nurturing. It includes the relational, seeing the whole picture, or the gestalt, and it's the intuitive part of men and women. Next, we'll look at perpetrators. The perpetrator knows who he or she can approach and violate before the event, because the child or the adult to whom it happens signals their vulnerability and availability to be treated that way. The perpetrator has a kind of a laser sense of knowing who is vulnerable and who's not vulnerable, and recognizing those individuals who are vulnerable. It's a compulsion that arises out of deep trauma. And this isn't meant to excuse the perpetrator, but just recognize that this is what's there, and that it's the disconnected self that perpetrates the trauma on others. And because of this, the perpetrator requires and deserves compassion and inquiry, including self-compassion. Next, we'll explore set, setting, and substances. Set is the intention of the individual or the group using a particular substance in a particular setting. And anything that bypasses the conscious mind can open us up. That would include certain plants, which have been used historically for greater consciousness in various cultures. The setting is the context, ideally under the guidance of a shaman who works with the plants, or a therapist who might work with pharmaceutical substances, who has been rigorously trained. For example, the FDA declared MDMA-assisted psychotherapy a breakthrough treatment for healing PTSD. But this isn't MDMA taken by a client alone in a room. It's the client takes MDMA and works with two therapists over 6 hours. And in that context, it can be a breakthrough treatment for healing PTSD. So it's very important that if you are working with a substance, you consider what's the intention, what's the substance, what's the setting, and have precautions been taken to ensure that you're working with people who are very skilled and experienced and can keep the environment safe. Next, we'll look at gut feelings, which are our ultimate protection against something from the outside that could harm us. In the wild, how long would we survive if we were cut off from our gut feelings? Emotions are the body's reaction to the mind, whereas gut feelings are the body's reaction to external reality. Gut feelings are never wrong, but they warn us of danger. How do you know the difference between a gut feeling and a strong emotion? With gut feelings, there's a calm knowing. You just know that something's dangerous, it's going to happen. We have to do something. And with strong emotions, there's a disturbance or agitation. There's a strong reaction. Emotions are not wrong in themselves, but they could be a reaction to the wrong perception created by the mind. So there could be strong emotion, but it's not based on fact. It's not based on reality. It's based on some perception in the mind. But a gut feeling is based on understanding reality and that there is danger. The problem is we disconnect from our gut feelings when we're children because it was adaptive for us. If we stayed connected with our gut feelings, it would have caused us to be in constant conflict with our environments because our gut is telling us this isn't the way it should be. Something's wrong here. But what can we do about it? We can't run away. We can't escape. So we disconnect from our gut feelings to survive, and we can either feel them and don't listen to them, or we don't even feel them, which is even a deeper disconnection. When that disconnection is there, it's a sign of trauma. It's a narrowing of our capacity to be in the world and to really listen to the signals that are inside of us. Gut feelings will tell us if you or the person you're communicating with is being authentic or not. You'll have a visceral response. So they guide us. With trauma, parts of the brain that gauge safety get confused. People who've been traumatized think that situations are safe when they're really dangerous. Or people who are traumatized consider situations are dangerous when they're really safe. So there's confusion on what's safe and what isn't safe. And this starts early in life, this confusion. For example, if a mother lets an infant cry for 2 hours before picking up the child, it confuses the child because there's the mother who's supposed to be the source of safety and nourishment, denying the child what it needs. So where does that child's safety lie? The child is confused. Then as children, we shut down our gut feelings in order to survive in our environment because it just doesn't make sense. We can't have that disconnect of knowing that something's off, but not being able to do anything about it. There's also a difference between gut feelings and intuition. Intuition is not the same. A gut feeling tells you about the situation outside of you. It lets you know if something is dangerous or safe. If you ignore it, you regret it. But you don't think about it, you don't analyze it, you just deal with it. Intuition is different. It's more of a communication between your heart, your brain, and the mind. Something just seems and feels right. It's not a reaction to a threat. So gut feeling is always a reaction to a threat. But an intuition is a truth about something, somebody, or a situation that moves you forward in your life and gives you the information that's helpful to you. The more experience you have, the more active your intuitions will be, because something is saying inside you, I've seen this before and this is what it meant. It just seems very familiar. And that's the end of Module 3, Gabor's teachings.